Hello everybody! In this video I'm going to introduce you to Maya's UVs. In my previous video I showed you how you could take pictures of interesting surfaces around you and use them as color textures in your materials in Maya. The examples I'm going to show you in this video will be a little bit more complicated. They'll require a little bit of work with UVs. For the first example, we're going to take a playing card and create a texture from it. For this example, we'll use the Jack of Diamonds. To create the texture, I'll be using the camera on my phone. I'll simply lay the card on the floor and take a picture of it. You might remember that in my previous video I gave a couple tips for making effective textures. I said, for example, that the texture should be square. I also mentioned that Maya prefers textures that are of dimensions like 512 by 512 or 1024 by 1024 or 2048 by 2048 pixels. This photograph is neither of those things. But even though it's not an ideal texture, it's going to still work very effectively in Maya. The first thing I'm going to do is create some geometry for my playing card. For a playing card, obviously a polygon plane will be perfect. I'm going to simplify the mesh by reducing the subdivision width and height. I measured the playing card and it is 3.5 inches in length and 2.5 inches in width. If I put these dimensions in the scale X and the scale Z, my geometry will have the right length to width ratio, just like the actual playing card. But because I don't actually want to have that scale data with my mesh selected, I'm going to go to Modify, Freeze Transformations, which will set the values back to 1, 1, and 1 on the scales. And there's actually a second way that I could get the right length to width ratio on my geometry. So I will show you that way as well. And to show you that, I'm going to delete this and start over again. Once again, I'll create a polygon plane, but this time I will change the width and height under the inputs. I'll be putting the same values I had previously put into the scale, 2.5 and 3.5. Notice that this method does not put any scale data in the channel box. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter whether you do it the first way I showed or the second way. So now that we have our geometry created, let's go ahead and create our material. And for this example, I'm going to use a blin. Playing cards usually have some specularity. They're not matte, so I think a blin would be most appropriate. With my material selected, I'll go to my attribute editor and I will apply my file to the color channel of my material. And again, I'd like to point out that while square textures are preferable, this texture is rectangular. Now that I have my material created, I will middle mouse drag it onto my geometry, and I will press 6 on my keyboard so that we can see the texture applied in the viewport. And unlike the examples from my previous video, this example is going to take a little bit of work with the mapping to get the texture to lay on the surface appropriately. And to accomplish this, I need to go to UV Editor. Notice that we don't see anything in the UV editor. However, if I select my mesh, we'll see the texture. In previous videos, we've looked at 3 different types of components of polygon objects. We've looked at vertices, we've looked at edges, and we've looked at faces. We'll now be looking at a 4th type of component, UVs. UVs cannot be moved in the camera viewports. We work with UVs in the UV editor. In the UV editor, I can move the UVs. Notice how moving the UVs causes the texture to swim through the mesh in my perspective viewport. I can also rotate my UVs, and I can scale them. Translating, rotating, and scaling UVs all affect the way that my texture is mapped to my polygon object. I'm now going to adjust the UVs in the UV editor so that my image is better mapped to my polygon plane. Notice that I can also adjust individual UVs to really get my texture mapped onto my object exactly. And now that I'm done adjusting my UVs in the UV editor, I can close the editor. And I now have a Jack of Diamonds playing card. We'll now take a look at a second example. This time we'll take a look at a stop sign. Again, notice that the image itself is not ideal. Not only is it not a square image, it's also been taken at a vantage point lower than the sign itself, giving a sense of perspective. To create my stop sign in Maya, I'm going to start with a cylinder. I'll make the cylinder have 8 sides, and I'll get rid of the cap segments. I'll also rotate it. I'm going to delete the geometry that I don't need. I will also center the pivot. Freeze the transforms. And now I'll create my material in the hypershade. Selecting my material, I'll go to the attribute editor and apply the image to the color channel of my material. Middle mouse dragging the material onto my polygon object and pressing 6 on my keyboard so I can see the texture applied to my stop sign. With my stop sign selected, I'll go to UV Editor, and I'll switch over to the UV component mode. And now, using the Translate, Rotate, and Scale tools, I will adjust the UVs to fit the sign. While this is pretty well mapped, I think there's a little bit of distortion happening. I think this is due to the fact that my polygon object is not composed of quads and triangles. Instead, it is an 8-sided polygon. I'm going to use my multi-cut tool from the modeling toolkit to add some geometry to my sign. And I'll return to my UV editor to do some final adjustments to the UVs. And here is my completed stop sign. These two examples were more complicated than in my previous video because they required working with the UV mapping. In addition, I used less than ideal textures because I wanted you to see how they too can be quite effective, even if not perfect. In my next video, I'll go over some slightly more complicated UV mapping scenarios. I hope this video was helpful for you, and thanks for watching.